Silk gloves and dust. I appreciate the ride, sir, but I believe there's been some mistake. The stage driver squinted down at the woman standing in the February dust of Meridian, Texas, her silk gloves catching what little afternoon light the clouds allowed. She wore a city hat with a velvet ribbon and a traveling dress the color of claret wine, buttoned to the throat with pearl buttons that had no business existing this far west of the Mississippi. She looked, truth be told, like she had fallen straight out of a Harper's Bazaar catalogue and landed in the wrong country entirely. Now, you have to understand a woman like Vivian Holt didn't end up in places like this by accident. She ended up here on purpose, and that makes all the difference. "No mistake, ma'am," the driver said, already gathering the reins. "Meridian, end of the line." The town wasn't much. A general store with a sagging awning, a livery stable, a church with paint peeling off its steeple like sunburned skin. 3 dogs slept in the street. The wind carried grit against Vivian's stockings and pushed at the brim of her city hat as though testing whether she belonged. She clutched the newspaper clipping in her gloved hand. The advertisement was 4 lines long, printed in small type between notices for patent medicine and land grants. Housekeeper wanted, honest work, fair wages, apply Samuel Gaines, Meridian, Texas. She had answered it from a hotel room in St. Louis with ink-stained fingers and a heart hammering so loud she was certain the woman in the next room could hear it. A man approached from the general store, sun-weathered face, clean shirt tucked into worn trousers, hat in his hand. He moved the way men move who are accustomed to open space, unhurried, deliberate, respectful of the ground beneath their boots. His eyes were the gray blue of winter sky, and they took her in without judgment or hurry. "Miss Holt." "Mr. Gaines." He nodded once. She extended her silk-gloved hand. He took it carefully, the way a man handles something he is afraid might tear. The wagon ride took 40 minutes over a road that was more suggestion than fact. Samuel didn't talk much, and Vivian learned more from the silence than she would have from conversation. The land stretched flat and brown to the horizon, broken only by mesquite and the occasional fence post leaning like a tired man resting against the wind. His spread came into view gradually, a clapboard house with a porch that sagged on one end, a barn that leaned east as though permanently braced against something it couldn't quite name, and 40 longhorns scattered across winter-brown grass like dark stones. A kitchen garden sat fenced beside the house, its soil frozen hard and bare, waiting for a warmth that February could not yet deliver. He carried her trunk inside. The house was sparse but clean-swept floors, a wood stove with a blackened pipe, a single plate and cup sitting on a shelf beside the wash basin. 1 chair at the table. Just the one. "Supper's at 6, bae," he said, pointing toward the kitchen. "Stove takes some convincing to light. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He set his hat on and walked out into the cold. Vivian stood in the kitchen looking at a cast-iron stove she had no earthly idea how to start. And for the first time since leaving Philadelphia, the full weight of what she had done settled across her shoulders like a yoke. A man who eats alone. Samuel had debated placing that advertisement for the better part of a year. He'd written it out on the back of a feed receipt one evening, the lamp burning low, his supper plate pushed aside with half a cold biscuit still on it. He'd read it back to himself, crossed it out, and tossed the receipt into the stove. A week later he wrote it again, a month after that. He carried the final version to the post office in Meridian and stood at the counter for a full minute before sliding it across to the postmaster. His ears burning like he was confessing to something shameful. 3 years he'd run this ranch alone, inheriting 40 head and 80 acres from a father who had died owing more than he ever earned. 3 years of setting 2 plates on the table out of habit, then catching himself and putting the second one back on the shelf. 3 years of mornings when the only voice in the house was his own. Talking to a horse that had the decency to listen but not the ability to answer. He didn't need a wife. He'd told himself that plainly, and he meant it. He needed a voice in the house, someone to fill the silence that collected in the corners like dust. What he got was Vivian Holt. He smelled the smoke from the barn. By the time he reached the kitchen, gray clouds billowed from the stove and Vivian stood in the middle of it, eyes streaming, holding a skillet of cornbread that had turned to charcoal. Her silk gloves were streaked with soot. A dish towel smoldered on the counter where she'd set it too close to the burner. She looked at him with an expression he recognized, the particular shame of failing at something you desperately wanted to master, laid bare before a witness you desperately wanted to impress. "I have never cooked a meal in my life," she said, her voice steady despite the tears the smoke had drawn. "I have never milked a cow or hauled water from a well. I should have told you that before I came." Samuel took the skillet from her hands, set it in the wash basin, and opened both windows. The smoke thinned. Cold February air rushed in carrying the scent of sage and dust. He pulled flour and lard from the shelf without a word and began working dough with his rough hands, pressing, folding, cutting rounds with a tin cup he kept for exactly this purpose. "Ain't nobody born knowing how to cook," he said, not looking up. "Trick with biscuits is gentle hands and a hot oven. Too much kneadin' makes 'em tough. You gotta let the dough do what it wants." She watched his hands, capable, scarred across the knuckles from fence wire and hoof kicks, sure of every movement, hands that knew what they were doing. "Show me again," she said. He did. Twice. The second batch came out passable golden on top, only slightly raw in the center. She held one up like a jeweler examining a stone, turning it in the lamplight. That night, after she had gone to her room, Samuel set a jar of hand salve beside the wash basin. He didn't knock on her door. He didn't mention it. Some things a man does quietly, and the doing is enough. The bottom drawer. Vivian could not sleep that first week. The wind was too large, the darkness too complete, and the silence between gusts held a quality she had never encountered in Philadelphia, the sound of absolutely nothing made by human hands. No carriage wheels on cobblestone, no gas lamps hissing, no servants moving through hallways with careful feet. Just wind and the occasional groan of the barn settling against its own lean. And beyond that, a darkness so vast it made her chest tight. She lay in the narrow bed and thought about Gerald Whitmore III, 52 years old, mutton chop whiskers, a shipping fortune built on cargo she was not encouraged to ask about. She remembered the smell of his parlor leather chairs, cigar smoke, and something sweet and cloying she later identified as hair pomade. Her mother had arranged the engagement over tea service, and Vivian had smiled through every minute of it, while something inside her chest slowly closed like a hand making a fist. She had left 3 weeks before the wedding, a note on her mother's writing desk, a hired carriage to the train station before dawn, a one-way ticket to St. Louis, and from there the advertisement, and from there this a narrow bed, a cold room, and a life she didn't yet know how to live. She sat up, opened her trunk, and lifted the silk gloves from the top. They were ruined now, soot-stained, wrinkled, smelling of wood smoke and lard and the particular failure of burned cornbread. She folded them with the same care her mother had taught her for fine things and placed them in the bottom of the drawer beneath her winter stockings. She put on a plain cotton work dress. The fabric was rough against her skin. She stepped outside into the February morning. Samuel was already splitting kindling by the woodpile, breath clouding an air cold enough to sting her nostrils. The sky above West Texas was enormous, pale and hard, and uninterested in what anyone thought of it. He looked up when she approached, read something in her face, and handed her the kindling bucket without being asked. Their fingers brushed against the handle. That drawer would not open again for a long, long time. Biscuits and blisters. Over the next several mornings, Samuel taught Vivian to make biscuits. The first batch burned black. The second came out flat as river stones. The third rose on one side and collapsed on the other like a barn, losing its argument with the wind. And Vivian stared at them with a fury that made Samuel bite the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. "Gentle hands," he reminded her. "You're fighting the dough. It ain't your enemy." "It certainly feels adversarial," she said through her teeth. "Most things worth doing feel that way at first." By the fourth morning, she produced a tray of biscuits that were golden on top, soft in the middle, and held together when you picked them up. Samuel bit into one at the breakfast table. He chewed slowly, the way a man chews when he is deciding something important. Then he nodded once. Vivian pressed both hands flat on the table and beamed like she had been handed a diploma from the finest school in the East. He taught her to haul water from the well, 2 wooden buckets on a yoke. balanced across the shoulders, the trick being in the hips and not the arms. She staggered the first 3 trips and sloshed half the water on her skirt. He taught her to milk the cow, a brown-eyed creature named Josephine who regarded Vivian with open contempt and shifted her weight every time Vivian found a rhythm with the pail. Milk ended up on her apron, her boots, and once, memorably, across the left side of her face. She laughed at herself freely and without shame, and the sound filled the barn in a way that startled both of them. Her hands blistered by the end of that first week. Then the blisters broke, and the skin beneath them toughened into something new. She stopped favoring her palms. She stopped wincing when she gripped the axe handle or the wire cutters or the rough hemp of the well rope. Samuel noticed the change each evening at supper, the way her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup without hesitation, the calluses forming along the base of each finger like a new language being written on her skin. One afternoon, they mended a fence together along the south pasture. They worked without speaking, handing wire and pliers back and forth in a rhythm that felt older than either of them, the easy coordination of 2 people whose bodies have begun to anticipate each other's movements. When they finished, they stood side by side looking at the mended line stretching toward the horizon, and the silence between them was not empty but full, the way a held breath is full. That evening, Samuel caught himself setting 2 plates for supper without thinking. His hand paused over the second plate. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it down across from his own, in the place where it had started to belong. Coyote song. See them clouds stacking up in the northwest. Vivian followed Samuel's finger toward the horizon, where gray formations piled like folded laundry against the pale winter sky. Storm, she asked. Nah, too high, too thin. That's the sky thinking about it, is all. When they drop low and go green at the bottom, that's when you worry, and when the air goes real still and the birds quit singing. You get yourself inside and don't argue with nobody about it. He taught her to read the weather, the way her tutors in Philadelphia had taught her French as a living language with grammar and idiom and poetry all its own. The smell before snow, sharp and metallic, like a coin held on the tongue. The way cattle turned their hindquarters to the north when the barometric pressure dropped. As reliable as any instrument, the sound the wind made shifting from west to southwest, which meant warming, versus northwest, which meant bundle up and check the stock. Vivian absorbed it with the same ferocity she had brought to the biscuits. She began reading the sky each morning before breakfast, reporting her predictions to Samuel, who would nod or gently correct her with the patience of a man who understood that the land teaches in its own time and will not be hurried. They sat on the porch that evening, as dusk settled over the range like a blanket being drawn across a sleeping child. Samuel leaned back in his chair, hooked his thumbs in his belt, and said nothing, which Vivian was learning meant he was listening to something she had not yet learned to hear. Then the coyotes began. It started as a single voice, high, wavering, impossibly lonesome, rising from somewhere beyond the creek bed to the south. Then others joined, one by one, until the darkness sang with a chorus that was neither sad nor joyful, but something far older than both. The sound moved through Vivian's chest like water through dry ground. She gripped the arm of her chair. "They sound lonely," she whispered. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "They sound like they found each other," he said. Here is what Vivian was only beginning to understand about Samuel Gaines: everything he had. He shared completely. His knowledge of the sky, his patience with her failures, his quiet way of making space at his table and on his porch for someone he barely knew. These were not ordinary kindnesses. They were everything he owned. The next evening, Vivian decided it was her turn to teach. She set 2 place settings at the table with careful precision: fork on the left, knife on the right, napkin folded into a triangle beneath. "In polite society," she said, adopting the instructional tone her mother used at dinner parties, "one begins with the outermost utensil and works inward toward the plate, the salad fork, the dinner fork, the dessert fork. Each has its purpose and its place." Samuel studied the arrangement with the grave attention of a man examining a land deed. He looked at the forks. He looked at her. Then he opened the single drawer in the kitchen and held up one fork, its tines slightly bent from years of honest use. "Reckon I'll start and finish with this one," he said. They laughed, Lord, how they laughed until Vivian had to sit down and press both hands against her stomach, until Samuel's eyes watered and he had to take off his spectacles and wipe them on his shirt tail, until the distance between a Philadelphia parlor and a West Texas kitchen collapsed entirely, and there was nothing left in the world but two people who understood that life is ridiculous and beautiful and far too short for pretending otherwise. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Vivian realized she had not thought about Philadelphia in 3 days. February wind. The cold came down like a hammer on the second week of February. Samuel knew it was coming before the thermometer confirmed it. He read it in the cattle's restlessness that afternoon, in the way they bunched together facing south, and in the barn, cats burrowing deep into the hay with their ears flat. By midnight, the temperature had plunged below anything the season had delivered yet, and his 40 longhorns were scattered across open pasture with no windbreak between them and the north. He dressed in the dark, pulling on every layer he owned. He had the horses saddled and was leading them from the barn when the kitchen door opened and Vivian stepped out wearing his spare coat over her work dress, a wool scarf wrapped twice around her head, her rough hands already pulling on work gloves. "Go back inside," he said. "I will not. You don't know how to work cattle in the dark. Then I expect I will learn tonight." He started to argue. He looked at her face in the lamplight jaw set, eyes steady, hands already reaching for the saddle horn, and he recognized the expression. It was the same one she wore when the biscuits burned, the one that meant she would stand in this cold until her boots froze to the ground before she would go back inside and wait. They rode out together into the bitter dark. For 3 hours they pushed longhorns toward the sheltered draw south of the creek. Working by starlight and instinct, Vivian could not ride well, but she could shout and wave her arms from the saddle, and the cattle moved. She fell once from the horse when a steer cut sideways, and once in the frozen mud along the creek bank when her boot slipped on ice. Both times she stood up, wiped her hands on her coat, and kept working without a sound. Near dawn, with the last of the herd bedded down in the draw where the bluff cut the wind, Samuel looked at Vivian in the gray half-light. Her face was raw with cold. Her lips were cracked. Her hands were bleeding at the knuckles where the reins had torn through her work gloves, rough, chapped, red hands that matched his own in every particular. He pulled the scarf from his own neck and wrapped her hands without thinking, holding them between his palms, breathing warm air across her broken knuckles. For a moment they stood like that in the frozen creek bottom while the cattle settled and the stars faded overhead. Then Samuel let go. He stepped back. He picked up the reins of his horse and turned toward the barn without meeting her eyes. The distance started that evening. He found work in the far pasture that kept him away until after dark. He ate his supper standing at the counter instead of sitting across from her. He answered her questions with single words and busied his hands with tack repair whenever the conversation tried to deepen. He was not angry. He was terrified. And the only way he knew to protect himself from wanting something he could not keep was to stop reaching for it entirely. Vivian set his supper plate by the barn door one night. He ate alone, leaning against a stall post, while lamplight from the kitchen window fell in a yellow square across the frozen yard between them. What her hands know. Vivian sat on the edge of her bed and tried to understand what had changed. Samuel's withdrawal was quiet but absolute, the careful way he stepped around her in the kitchen, the clipped answers that closed conversations like doors shutting, the barn where he spent his evenings doing work that could have waited until morning. She replayed the cattle drive in her mind, searching for her error. She had fallen in the mud. She had slowed him down. She was a Philadelphia socialite in borrowed clothes, playing at a life she had no right to claim, and he had finally seen through the performance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, her mother's handwriting, precise and furious on cream-colored paper delivered by the Meridian postmaster. Vivian stood in the kitchen and read it twice. The wedding has been rescheduled for March. Gerald has generously agreed to overlook your indiscretion. You will return immediately. Your father's debts require it. She set the letter on the table and pressed her palms flat against the wood. She could feel the grain beneath her calluses, rough oak, scarred by years of use, solid and real. Through the window she could see the barn where Samuel was working. The lamp was lit. His shadow moved across the wall. That night, after the house went quiet, Vivian knelt before her trunk and opened the bottom drawer. The silk gloves lay folded where she had placed them, clean white against the rough pine. Impossibly soft, belonging to another woman in another life. She lifted the right glove and tried to slide it onto her hand. The silk caught on her calluses. The seam resisted at the base of her fingers where the skin had thickened from axe handles and well ropes and fence wire. She pushed gently, then firmly. The glove would not go on, not because her hand had grown larger, but because it had changed shape entirely, wider across the knuckles, rougher along the palm. Mapped with small scars and the particular toughness that comes from doing real work in a real world, she held both hands up in the lamplight and turned them slowly, examining them the way Samuel had taught her to examine clouds, reading what they meant, not just what they looked like. These hands had kneaded dough at dawn. These hands had gripped frozen rains in the dark and hauled water in the cold and mended fence wire until the pliers left marks across her palms. These hands were the most honest thing about her. She placed the glove back in the drawer. She let her fingers rest on the silk for one breath, feeling the smoothness one final time, acknowledging what it had meant and what it no longer meant. Then she closed the drawer. The sound was quiet and final, like a door settling into its frame. She was not afraid of the frontier. She had not been afraid of the frontier for days. What kept her awake? What made her listen for his footsteps on the porch each evening? What turned her toward the barn light like a moth was the fear that Samuel Gaines did not want her to stay. Vivian pulled the chair to the kitchen table and took out paper and pen, not to answer her mother's demands, not to apologize to Gerald Whitmore. She began to write something else entirely, something that had been building in her chest since the first morning she stepped outside in a cotton dress and felt the February wind on her face and understood, with a certainty she had never felt in any parlor, that she was exactly where she belonged. The letter to Mama. The evening before Valentine's Day, Vivian sat at Samuel's kitchen table with a pen and a clean sheet of paper and wrote the most important letter of her life. She didn't write about Gerald Whitmore or the rescheduled wedding or her father's debts. She didn't argue or apologize or make excuses. She wrote about biscuits, about the way flour feels between calloused fingers when you have finally learned not to fight the dough, about a barn that leans east and 40 longhorns and a kitchen garden that will not grow in February but holds the stubborn promise of sage and tomatoes come spring. She wrote about a man who teaches without condescension and gives without expectation and sets a jar of hand salve by the wash basin without ever mentioning it. A man who reads the sky like scripture and listens to coyotes like they are singing hymns and owns one fork and has never once apologized for it. Dear Mama, she wrote, I know you will not understand this, and I know it will cause you pain, and I'm sorry for that. But I must tell you the truth. My hands are rough now. My silk gloves do not fit anymore, and I find I do not miss them. I rise before dawn to haul water and split kindling and make biscuits from flour and lard, and I am happier than I have ever been in all my life. I found a man who owns almost nothing and gives everything. I'm not coming home. I'm already there. She sealed the letter and set it on the table. The ink was still drying on the envelope when Samuel came in from evening chores, stamping the cold from his boots, bringing with him the smell of hay and horses in February air. He hung his hat on the peg by the door. He saw the letter. He saw her face. What's that? He asked carefully. A letter to my mother? She pushed it across the table toward him. I would like you to read it. That's your private business, Miss Holt. Vivian, she said, and I'm asking you, please. He sat down across from her in the chair that had become his chair. At the table where two plates now sat every evening and unfolded the letter with hands that were not entirely steady. His lips moved slightly as he read, the way they did when he was concentrating. The kitchen was quiet except for the wind pressing against the windows and the low tick of the stove cooling. Vivian watched his eyes move across her words. She watched him reach the line about the hand salve and his jaw tighten. She watched him reach the line about owning nothing and giving everything, and she saw the brightness gather in his eyes and the effort it took him not to look away. He folded the letter. He pressed it against his chest with both hands and sat very still. I pulled away, he said, his voice rough at the edges. These last days, I pulled away because I reckoned you would leave come spring.
Figured what I got here, this house, this land, 40 head and a leanin' barn ain't enough to hold a woman like you.
A woman like me, Vivian said. A woman who deserves better than one fork in a cold kitchen. She reached across the table and placed her rough hand over his. The calluses caught against each other palm to palm, scar to scar, the same work written on both. I will thank you not to decide what is enough for me. Samuel Gaines. Her voice was steady and warm and carried a steel in it that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with certainty. You have given me more than any parlor in Philadelphia ever could. Every morning, every biscuit, every evening on that porch. He turned his hand beneath hers. Their fingers laced together, rough against rough, cracked skin against cracked skin. Two hands that had learned the same language from the same land. Neither of them moved for a long time. February. Sage. Samuel rose before dawn on Valentine's morning. The house was quiet. Vivian was sleeping in her room down the hall, her room. He thought, though somewhere in the past 2.5 weeks, it had stopped being the spare room and become part of the house's heartbeat, as essential as the kitchen or the porch or the barn. He pulled on his boots and stepped into the February cold. The sky was lightening along the eastern edge, not sunrise yet, but the promise of it, the kind of pale gold light that makes a man believe the world is being assembled fresh, that whatever was broken yesterday might be mended today. He walked to the kitchen garden. The fence post stood in frozen ground, the soil hard and bare, but along the south-facing edge, where the house wall blocked the worst of the north wind and held the day's thin warmth a little longer. A single patch of sage had survived the winter. Its leaves were gray-green and leathery, curled tight against the cold, dusted with frost that caught the early light like sugar on a cake. When he rubbed a leaf between his thumb and forefinger, the scent rose sharp and clean, the smell of something that refused to surrender to the season. He cut a small sprig with his pocket knife and held it to his nose. Sage and cold air and the faintest trace of the spring that was coming, whether February wanted it or not. Inside, Vivian was setting the table for breakfast. 2 plates, 2 cups, 1 fork apiece. She had made biscuits golden brown, soft in the center, perfect in every way that mattered. The kitchen smelled of coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, fresh bread, and the particular warmth of a wood stove that has been tended by someone who knows what she is doing. Samuel stood in the doorway with the sage behind his back.
She looked up and smiled, not the polished smile she had worn stepping off the stage in Meridian, but something unguarded and real. A smile that had calluses on it and something in his chest that had been clenched for 3 solitary years quietly opened, like a fist becoming a hand, like a hand reaching out. He crossed the kitchen and tucked the sprig of February sage into her hair, just above her left ear. His rough fingers brushed her temple. She reached up and touched the small gray-green leaves and understood without being told a valentine from the land itself. Not from any store, not a diamond, not a ribbon, a gift that had survived the worst the winter could deliver and come through fragrant and alive. It's the toughest thing in the garden, he said. Freezes, thaws, freezes again. Keeps growing no matter what. Sounds like someone I know, she said softly. Sounds like 2 people I know. Remember those silk gloves, that city hat with the velvet ribbon? The woman who stepped off the stage in Meridian looking like she had fallen out of a catalogue and landed on another planet. She was still here. Same woman, same stubborn spine, same quick mind, same laugh that could fill every room in a clapboard house. But her hands told a different story now. Rough hands that knew flour and fence wire and frozen rains at midnight. Hands that fit inside a rancher's hands like they had been made for exactly that purpose. By a craftsman who understood what honest work looks like and what honest love requires. They sat on the porch after breakfast, side by side, wrapped in wool blankets, watching the sun climb above the flat brown land. The longhorns moved slowly across the winter grass. The barn leaned east, the way it always had and always would. The kitchen garden waited under its crust of frost for the spring that was coming. Somewhere beyond the creek, the coyotes had gone quiet.
But they would sing again at dusk. They always did. And two people would be sitting right here to listen together, unhurried, content in a way that no parlor and no fortune and no silk glove could ever provide. I reckon that is the truest thing anyone ever learned on the frontier. A full life ain't measured by what you own. It is measured by who sits beside you when the coyotes sing. Contentment don't live in parlors. It lives wherever someone loves you honest and plain.